Hello, my name is Eric Patterson, and this is the Religious Freedom Institute's 3 Questions on Ukraine interview series. At the Religious Freedom Institute, we work to secure religious freedom for everyone, everywhere around the world. The purpose of the 3 Questions on Ukraine interview series, in the context of the ongoing conflict there, is to increase understanding of the religious dynamics of the region and the many dimensions of religious freedom present in Ukraine. My guest today is Father Deacon Andrew Bennett. The Reverend Dr. Andrew P.W. Bennett is Program Director for Religious Freedom and the Director of Faith Community Engagement at Cardis. He's an ordained deacon in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in the Eparchy of Toronto in Eastern Canada. Previously, he served as Canada's first ambassador for religious freedom from 2013 to 2016. And he previously served here at the Religious Freedom Institute as director of our North American Action Team, and he continues to assist us as senior fellow. Welcome, Father Deacon Andrew.
Thank you, Eric. It's wonderful to be with you.
Let's get started. Ukraine has a pluralist religious landscape with many churches, denominations, and faiths peacefully coexisting and engaging in regular dialogue. How does this confessionalism contrast with the Russian approach to religious freedom?
Well, this is a really important distinction that needs to be made between Russia and Ukraine. And I think it is at the heart in some ways of the religious nature of this conflict. Ukraine, for a very long time, going right back into the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, was, although the borders were very different from what it is today, that territory, especially the territory in Western Ukraine, down into the Crimea, and then, of course, the eastern part of Ukraine, has always been highly diverse religiously. You had the presence and now the resurgence of a very large Jewish community, especially in parts of Galicia. You had the presence of a diversity of Orthodox expressions. You had certainly from the late 16th century, my own church, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, that came into communion with Rome at that time. You've had different Orthodox jurisdictions. Right now, we have the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is the largest of the 3 Orthodox churches in Ukraine, and then the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. You also have, and there have been over centuries, a growth in various Protestant communities in Ukraine, whether that be early Lutheran communities, Unitarian communities, and then in more recent times, Pentecostal communities, Baptist communities, and the presence of smaller but growing groups such as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Jehovah's Witnesses, various evangelical Protestant denominations, and even the presence of groups such as the Armenian Apostolic Church. There's a very ancient Armenian church in Lviv in Western Ukraine. And then, of course, a large Crimean Tatar and Ukrainian Tatar Muslim population that's been there for many, many, many centuries. And so this is really very much part of the fabric of Ukraine. And these communities have worked together in public dialogue for many decades, especially through the All Ukraine Council of Churches and Religious Organizations. In Russia, however, we have an attempt, certainly not just under the Putin regime, but certainly during the Soviet period and even during the Tsarist period, to try and limit the presence of any sort of religious community, especially Christian community, that would rival the Russian Orthodox Church. And we see now, even in Russia, any other expression of Orthodoxy that is not the Moscow Patriarchate is frustrated. My own church, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, it basically exists as an underground church in Russia. The Putin regime for the last many number of years has been restricting the activities of Pentecostals, of Baptists, of various other Protestant denominations. And they certainly have not been friends to other groups, such as the Jehovah's Witnesses, that are now banned in Russia. And so I would say that in the Russian context, we have a very monolithic understanding. We have a monolithic understanding of politics. There has to be the strong man. That seems to be the Putin understanding. We also have this monolithic understanding of religion. And in Ukraine, for all of its messiness, there's a very strong confessionalism that has existed and has deep roots in Ukrainian history.
That's very, very helpful. And Jose Castanova, in an interview in the series, talked about this as denominationalism to try to distinguish these different churches there. But let's focus in on the national churches in Ukraine. We often hear this term, or we refer to the national churches, by which we mean in some countries those that are established by the state. Ukraine is different with a number of large church bodies. Could you explain to us the different understanding of national churches in Ukraine and how these churches are responding in the conflict?
This is, again, a crucial question and a distinction that we can make between Russia and Ukraine. As I said, the Moscow Patriarchate, particularly under President Putin's reign in Russia, has been the privileged expression of Christianity, and certainly the privileged expression of Orthodoxy. And obviously this has deep historical roots. There's a concept within the Byzantine tradition dating back to the Byzantine Empire of symphonia, where church and state have this very close relationship. Now, the way we might think of symphonia now is unfortunately expressed in Russia by I would argue, a far too close connection between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state. Mirroring in many ways how the Russian Orthodox Church at various times was privileged during the Soviet period. But now we have sort of a flowering of orthodoxy in many respects in Russia, but there is this very, very close relationship. In effect, the Russian Orthodox Church is an established church. It is the established church in Russia. In Ukraine, the Moscow Patriarchate, the Russian Orthodox Church, has a presence in Ukraine. It's the second largest Orthodox jurisdiction. It has a lot of monasteries, seminaries, churches, bishops, lay faithful, clergy, and so forth. And it has a bit of a precarious position now in Ukraine because it has this identification with Moscow, where that church is established, we can argue. But in Ukraine, it is still the church of many Ukrainians who are strongly identifying as Ukrainians, not as Russians. And so this creates a bit of a tension. And I think the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate is in this very difficult position now. The largest church, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which I'm sure Jose described in his podcast, is a relatively new church. Its precursor churches came together, I think, roughly 5 years ago now, and were granted autocephaly by Constantinople, by the Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople. And the Orthodox Church of Ukraine is very much a national church. It is not established, but it has a very strong connection with Ukrainian identity and with an understanding of orthodoxy within Ukraine. And so it's a very important church. It has played a very prominent role, especially since the Maidan Revolution of 2014, in taking a strong stand for Ukrainian patriotism. It's not an established church, though. And in the same way, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church has this national characteristic to it. Again, it advocates a certain patriotic feeling, but always in the context of Christian faith and in the faith of the Ukrainian people. So in this sense, I would say the churches in Ukraine, we can call them national churches because they identify very strongly with the Ukrainian nation, not with the state. Whereas in Russia, I think we can say that the Russian Orthodox Church identifies very strongly with the Russian nation, but the Russian nation and the state are very much fused now. And I don't think that is necessarily a helpful thing.
These distinctions you've made are very, very helpful. You've hit at an older social science literature and religious history literature that talked about a Christendom model with the fusion of church and state, where they're deeply, deeply integrated, and how different that is from one model of a religiously free social marketplace, where you could have national churches, but they are not established. They are not, and they may have schools or educational programs or charitable programs that actually might receive, like other organizations, some government funding, but they are entirely independent from the state, from state strictures. They are not established. The state is not using its power to coerce people to join or to leave. It's not coercing people to have membership in one of those types of things. And they're authentic, important social actors. And this is one model. It's a different model than so-called religious freedom in France. And it's a bit different than our model in the United States, but it's clearly a model that works for the Ukrainian people. In fact, amazingly, over the 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Ukrainian populace has become more religious, not just in identification, but also in practice rather than less. And I would argue that there's a major role of that is this disestablishment where people are following their hearts, following their spiritual impulses, actually back into church. Well,
That's right.
Let's talk about what this means in the present crisis. Worst case scenario, if Russia extends its borders into part of Ukraine or absorbs a large part or all of Ukraine, what do you think this means for the different faith communities on the ground there?
I think we will rapidly see a deterioration in the religious freedom situation in Ukraine. And Crimea, Russian-occupied Crimea, offers us a valuable insight as to how a Russian puppet regime would begin to deal with various religious communities in Ukraine. Very quickly after invading and then annexing Crimea to the Russian Federation, the Russian authorities and Russian proxies began to violate the religious freedom of various communities in Ukraine and in Crimea. In particular, what was then the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kievan Patriarchate, one of the precursor churches to the now Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Russian proxies firebombed the residence of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kievan Patriarchate bishop in Crimea. They intimidated Ukrainian Greek Catholic priests. They basically forcibly disbanded various representative bodies for Crimean Tatars. And that is the image that I think we could project and foreshadow if Russia is successful in occupying large sections of Ukraine, all of Ukraine. If they take Kyiv and set up a puppet regime, they will immediately, I think in very short time, they would begin to frustrate the religious freedom of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which, remember, is the largest Orthodox jurisdiction now in the country. They would also begin to frustrate the activities of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And any time that Russia has controlled Ukraine, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church has been suppressed, in some cases violently. We have to remember that between 1946 and 1990, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church under the Soviet Union was the largest, quote unquote, illegal church in the world. And all of its bishops, except for one, suffered and died in prison camps or as a result of what they suffered in those prison camps. So it's not a pretty picture as to what could happen. And I think in terms of, again, smaller communities within Ukraine, such as, again, Jehovah's Witnesses, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, other smaller Protestant denominations would probably face significant restriction on their activity. So we really have to recognize that this war, this expanded invasion of Ukraine, remembering that the invasion took place in 2014, and what we're seeing now is an expanded invasion. This is not just a geopolitical reality. It's not just an economic reality. It is a religious reality. And the Putin regime has instrumentalized religion and continues to propagate lies about the nature of Kievan Rus and the founding of the Orthodox Christian tradition in Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. The Russian Orthodox Church is not the only heir of the conversion of Kievan Rus in 988. There are 3 churches in Ukraine that are heirs to that conversion. And so if Russia gains, if the Putin regime gains control over Ukraine, we will see a lot of false history being propagated on a much larger scale.
Andrew, this is fascinating, and it's very helpful to have these contrasts between the lived religion on the ground in Ukraine and that in Russia. I recall that in a recent lecture, Jose Casanova said that any given Sunday, 3 times as many Ukrainians are participating in worship as their Russian citizens just over that border. And you've also helped us to have a sense when you discuss what's happening in Ukraine. Russia has a track record. We've seen it over the past 7 years since the invasion of Crimea. There's evidence there about the processes and the procedures about how they dispel any centers of on-the-ground authentic authority, whether it's political, but also in this case, the religious and spiritual authorities. So is there anything that we've missed or any last thoughts?
I think the only last thing I would say, Eric, is that we have to, again, be very aware of the Russian approach and the Russian strategy in this regard. What might seem as simply, minor administrative inconveniences for churches, such as the forced registration of churches, the registration of clergy that we saw in Crimea very soon after the Russian annexation, over time will lead to more serious forms of persecution and restriction. And again, here, we tend to talk about violations of religious freedom in terms of social hostilities by one group against another group and by government restrictions. What we see in the Russian case, and by extension in Russian occupied parts of Ukraine, is significant government restrictions, but we should not be naive to diminish those as merely administrative inconveniences for certain churches. It is the short end of the stick, and we will begin to see more, if there is, I hope not, but if there is greater Russian control exerted over Ukraine, we will see significant decline in religious freedom there. And this is something that I think Western leaders need to be well aware of. And certainly the good work that RFI does will help to make that present to those that can influence the situation in Ukraine.
Well, Father Deacon Andrew Bennett, thank you so much for this insightful interview about the conditions on the ground in Ukraine during this terrible war.
Thank you, Eric. It was a pleasure.